Welcome to the recording for Chapter 11. We are on the nervous system, the different divisions of the nervous system. So in this series of videos, we're only going over the information in the red, the information denoted high yield. So these recordings will only be the high yield information for Chapter 11. General characteristics of the nervous system. So when you're talking about the central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord. These are two parts of the nervous system that are literally in the center of your body, and they are figuratively where all the information goes or comes from that the nervous system has to transmit from one place to another. The brain is the largest and most complex portion of the nervous system. It controls how we sense things, how we perceive the world around us, how we move, and how we think. The brain has the different parts of the brain are the two cerebral hemispheres. Remember, hemi means half, a sphere is a circle. So the two cerebral hemispheres are the two halves of the largest part of the brain. You have the diencephalon, the brainstem, and the cerebellum. So parts of the brain are the two cerebral hemispheres, the diencephalon, the brainstem, and the cerebellum. The brainstem is the part of the brain that starts off in the brain, but then continues in the vertebral canal. It goes through the foramen magnum to become the brain stem. To become the spinal cord from the brain stem. Both the brain and the spinal cord connect to the peripheral nervous system by way of peripheral nerves. So, in order for the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord, to communicate with other parts of the body, it has to have nerves that leave the brain, leave the spinal cord, and innervate other parts of the body. Once they leave the brain and the spinal cord, those nerves become the peripheral nervous system. So the brain and the spinal cord connect to the peripheral nervous system because of these peripheral nerves that come off of or lead into the brain and spinal cord. You have meninges. Meninges are membranes that protect the brain and spinal cord. They sit between the soft tissues of the brain and the spinal cord and the bone that protects it. So meninges are the membranes that protect the soft tissue of the brain and the spinal cord. It sits between the soft tissue and the bone that protects it, so the skull and the vertebral column. The meninges, you may have heard of the term meningitis. A lot of college students or people are afraid that college students will develop meningitis, that is inflammation of these meninges. So the meninges, again, this is a membrane that protects and covers the brain and the spinal cord. There are three different layers of meninges. You have the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. The dura mater is the outermost layer. It is the toughest layer. So think that the outer layer of membrane has to be the thickest and the toughest because it's the first line of defense. So the way I think about dura mater is I think of it as more like wax paper. So in the kitchen, when people are cooking, sometimes they use this wax paper to cover their food, to bake their food, to protect their food. Dura mater, in my mind, is more like that tough, dense connective tissue. It makes up the dural sinuses. And because of the dura mater, you have the epidural space. Remember, epi means above or outside of. The epidural space is the space between the dura mater and the skull, or the dura mater and the vertebral bones, the vertebral canal. That is that space. So, for example, when someone is getting an epidural during childbirth, that is medication being deposited in the space uh, above or superficial to the dura mater and deep to the vertebral column. So between that space between the dura mater and the bone. The next layer, and dura mater translates to tough mother. Dura meaning durable, mater, a word for mother. So dura mater, tough mother. The tough mother is outside, protecting everything. The next deeper layer, the middle layer, you have the arachnoid mater or spider mother. They call it the arachnoid mater because when they looked at it, they saw that it looked like a bunch of spider webs coming off of that layer. So because it looked more like spider webs, they called it the arachnoid mater. In the associated with the arachnoid mater, you have the subarachnoid space, so the space that is just deep to the arachnoid mater. This is where your cerebrospinal fluid fills in or goes. Cerebrospinal fluid is the fluid that bathes the brain and the spinal cord, gives it nutrients, allows it to stay moisturized, is a place where the cells can drop off their waste product. Eventually, the cerebrospinal fluid is taken back into circulation, cleaned up, and can then at some point become cerebrospinal fluid again. Then you have the pia mater. The deepest inner layer of the meninges is the pia mater. Pia mater translates to delicate mother. The pia mater is the layer that lays directly on the brain and spinal cord. So remember again, the brain and the spinal cord are very delicate tissue. So you would not want something like wax paper touching the brain and spinal cord. But the pia mater, the delicate mother, is attached to the surface of the brain and spinal cord. I think of the pia mater more like saran wrap that is touching your brain and spinal cord and protecting it. The pia mater contains blood vessels and nerves. So these are the blood vessels that are going to feed the brain itself. Yeah, and the nerves that are associated with the meninges and the bones and the brain. So pia mater is the layer that nourishes the meninges. So the three layers of meninges: dura mater, durable mother, most superficial; arachnoid mater, the spider mother, which is in the middle; and the pia mater, or delicate mother, which is the deepest layer that is touching the brain and spinal cord. In this image, you will see that you have the pink, where's the word? The pink, which is the most superficial, is the dura mater. And then in the middle, where you have all of these, what looks like spider webs, it's the arachnoid mater. And then you have the orange, which is the pia mater. Oops. So, dura mater, arachnoid mater, pia mater. In this case, this is the skull. So you have the bone of the skull itself, where the dura mater actually touches the skull. And then this would be the brain. So this is the gray matter of the brain, the white matter of the brain, and the pia mater is directly touching the brain. In the spinal cord, same idea. You have the vertebrae, the vertebral bone. You have the dura mater that lines the inside of the bone. You have the arachnoid mater in the middle. you have the pia mater directly touching the spinal cord. Ventricles and cerebrospinal fluid. So cerebrospinal fluid is produced in these four cavities called ventricles. These ventricles are connected to one another within the cerebrum and the brainstem. So four cavities, four spaces. The ventricles are four spaces that are connected to one another inside of the cerebrum and the brain stem. The ventricles are then connected to the central canal of the spinal cord. So if we go back to the most recent image, you'll notice on this left image, there's this black dot in the middle. On the right image, it's sort of being covered, but there is a black dot. That is actually a space in the middle of the vertebral column. So a space in the middle of not the vertebral column, the spinal cord. So that is the space that is continuous with the ventricles so that the cerebrospinal fluid can have a space to bathe the inner cells of the spinal cord. So the four ventricles, you have the two lateral ventricles. Individually, we'll call them the first and second ventricle, the third ventricle, and the fourth ventricle. Very simple names. First, second, third, and then fourth. You have the interventricular foramina that connects the third ventricle to the lateral ventricle. So these to these, interventricular foramina. And then the cerebral aqueduct. An aqueduct is basically like a water catch basin. It is like a tube that collects water to send it out in different places in a city. So like New Orleans gets a lot of rain. Some of that rain will be collected in these aqueducts, and the aqueduct will then, they'll all feed into some other kind of duct system and eventually go to the lake or a bayou or the river or something. But an aqueduct is something that collects fluid, collects watery fluid, and then distributes it somewhere else. So the cerebral aqueduct will connect the third and fourth ventricles, collecting fluid from the third ventricle, sending it to the fourth ventricle. So when you look at a brain, so this is the anterior part of the brain. This back here is the posterior part. So again, anterior, posterior. You'll see the lateral ventricles here. So the first and second ventricle, I don't know which one is the first and which one is the second, so we'll just call them the lateral ventricles. If you look at it from a side view, you can see the lateral ventricles there. One is here and one is on the other side there. They're connecting to the third ventricle via the interventricular foramina. Interventricular foramina. Then you have the third ventricle that's connected to the fourth ventricle through the cerebral aqueduct. Cerebrospinal fluid is secreted by choroid plexuses. The singular is choroid plexus, but because it's more than one, it's the choroid plexuses. These are special capillaries of the pia mater that are covered in ependymal cells. Remember in the previous chapters, we talked about neuroglia. Neuroglia are cells that support the neurons in the nervous system. The neurons are the main players of the nervous system, but the neuroglia are cells that support the neurons. And if the neuroglia were not there, the neurons couldn't do their job. One of those neuroglia are the ependymal cells. Ependymal cells are the cells that cover the pia mater and secrete cerebrospinal fluid into the ventricles. Cerebrospinal fluid is basically a modified blood plasma. So these ependymal cells will take blood that runs through, that's running through those vessels and pull some of the plasma out, but it filters it because it does not want everything that's in the blood to go into the brain. Even though we would like to think that all the fluid and all the materials that are dissolved in our bloodstreams is healthy and safe for the brain, because the brain and the spinal cord are so delicate, not even everything in the blood is supposed to be interacting with the brain tissue. So the ependymal cells will take the blood and it will pull certain parts of the blood out to create cerebrospinal fluid. The cerebrospinal fluid that is secreted by these choroid plexuses act as a nutritive, has a nutritive function and a protective function in the CNS. Again, it has substances in it that nourish the cells of the brain and spinal cord. And because it is a watery fluid, it can protect it. For example, it can act as a shock absorber. So when you're running and you have a sudden stop, the structures don't hit the brain or the spinal cord, I'm sorry, the skull or the vertebral canal. It'll, some of that shock will be absorbed in the fluid. That is a way that the cerebrospinal fluid can protect the central nervous system. The cerebrospinal fluid, I'll call it CSF for now. From now on, CSF helps to maintain a stable ionic concentration in the CNS. So you have these ions, magnesium, calcium, potassium, sodium. You have all of these ions that are needed by the cells of the central nervous system. And some of those ions will be located in the CSF so that the cells of the CSF can use it whenever it needs it to function or to maintain that balance. CSF circulates in the ventricles, in the central canal of the spinal cord, and in the subarachnoid space. So you have the fluid flowing in the ventricles, so lateral ventricles, third and fourth ventricle. Then it goes down into the cerebral, the central canal of the spinal cord, and then it also flows in the subarachnoid space. After it exchanges substances, the CSF is then absorbed by these structures called arachnoid granulations, absorbed in order to go back into general circulation so that it can be cleaned up, and then re-nutriented, given more nutrients and cleaned up of the waste products so that the ependymal cells can then make more CSF. There's about 140 milliliters of CSF at any given time. If you look at a water bottle, a 16-ounce water bottle, you'll notice that that water bottle is 500 milliliters. 500 milliliters is roughly 2 cups. So 16 ounces is 2 cups. So a cup would be 250 milliliters. So at any given time, we have less than a cup of cerebrospinal fluid or CSF floating around our brain and spinal cord at any given time. So here you will notice the flow of cerebrospinal fluid in the brain and the spinal cord. So these are the ventricles. If remember, it's lined with ependymal cells, and the ependymal cells are creating and secreting the CSF into the ventricles. The ventricles will then flow following the arrows. So following the arrows, it goes down into the central canal of the spinal cord. As it goes through the central canal, it then empties out into the subarachnoid space. Just because there's no more spinal cord does not mean there is no more meninges. The meninges are lining the entire way down. So you have the CSF that leaves the central canal, goes into that subarachnoid space, and then is shunted back up. So it goes down and around, is shunted back up, bathes the rest of the brain, bathes the rest of the brain, and is eventually pulled back into circulation. So you notice these bits here are what they're using to describe the arachnoid granulations. And remember, the arachnoid granulations are the portions, are the structures that are responsible for absorbing the CSF from these structures and bringing it back into circulation. Traumatic brain injury, TBI. So, traumatic brain injury is a result of a mechanical force. Mechanical force means some kind of physical force that actually causes movement of the brain, causes an actual blow to the brain and the spinal cord. So this can be a fall, an attack, an accident, or some kind of sports injury where a person is moving, their brain is moving, the person suddenly stops, their brain keeps going. Eventually, it hits the side of the skull and can damage the skull. So the first type of TBI is a concussion. Concussion is a mild TBI. It typically results from a one-time injury and usually has no lasting symptoms. So when a person develops a concussion, whether it's because they are being they are falling from some height, they're in a motor vehicle accident, or because of a sports injury, it's a one-time thing that usually doesn't have lasting symptoms. The reason why we've heard so much about concussions and brain injuries in the media over the last 10 years or so is because uh, the more people get these concussions, the more serious the problem can eventually become because the more times they damage the brain, the more the brain wants to scar to heal those damages. And that can lead lasting problems. So the concussion itself, as long as a person only has one, rests and allow their brain to heal, then it should be fine. Then you have chronic traumatic encephalopathy. So encephalo, well, let's go back. Cephalo refers to the head. So cephalo means head. Encephalo means brain. Pathy, disease. So this is a disease in the brain, right? Caused by chronic trauma. Chronic meaning something happened repeatedly or several times over the course of 3 to 4 months at minimum. So anything chronic has to happen over the course of several months. And it's traumatic because it's a physical trauma. There is actually a mechanical force that is causing the disease of the brain because of that chronic trauma. So also called CTE. So CTEs are sports-related injuries because athletes in their sports tend to do these functions or actions over and over again. The actions that cause the concussion can continuously cause the concussions, which can lead to chronic traumatic encephalopathy. So this is a mild but repetitive TBI, whereas a concussion is a mild singular TBI. So CTE results from many small injuries over time. Eventually, the symptoms begin years after the trauma had occurred and can have long-lasting effects on memory and behavior. Then you have blast-related brain injuries. This is a severe TBI, whereas the other two were mild. It results from explosions in combat situations or any situation where a person is exposed to explosions, um, exposed to explosions. So blast-related brain injuries will often lead to cognitive decline years after the injury because of, again, the size of the blast, those blast waves physically pushing on the brain, causing the brain injury itself, and because the brain could hit the side of the skull, leading to damage that can scar over time, that can cause those cognitive declines. So the brain. The brain contains centers for and performs the following functions. You have neurocenters for sensory function. So these are little pockets of location that allows the sensory structures of the body to actually perceive or interpret what it means, what those sensations mean. That is the sensations and perceptions piece. It has motor commands for your skeletal muscles. So it allows or tells your skeletal muscles to move. You have higher mental functioning. So like memory and reasoning. These are part of what separates humans to what are called lower animals or lower life forms. So we have this ability to remember vast amounts of information, and we have the ability to reason, to use our brains, our logic, to come up with different situations or to create different situations. Neurocenters for coordinating muscular movements. So not only do you have the motor commands, but you can also then coordinate those movements so that we can actually have larger functioning. I'm able to walk because all of these muscles have coordinated to allow me to move from one place to another. You have neurocenters for regulating visceral activities. So regulating the functioning of the uh, organs. And then your personality is created in your brain. All right. So in brain development, when the sperm meets the egg, comes together to form the zygote, and those cells start to divide and divide and divide, you get the blastula, you get the morula, all of that stuff. So what I want you to know for brain development is that when the zygote is starting to form multiple cells, eventually a piece of the or some cells in that cell ball eventually fold in on itself to become a tube. We call that the neural tube. That neural tube eventually becomes the central nervous system. Um, the brain will then form these three cavities that will become different parts of the central nervous system. So it forms the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. The forebrain is called the prosencephalon. Midbrain is called the mesencephalon. Hindbrain is called the rhombencephalon. The forebrain, well, no. So then the forebrain becomes the cerebrum, the basal nuclei, and the diencephalon. The midbrain stays the midbrain, and we know that the midbrain is part of the brain stem. And then we have the hindbrain that eventually becomes the cerebellum, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. The pons and the medulla oblongata are also parts of the brain stem. So let's talk about the different parts of the brain itself, the adult brain. So the adult brain has four major portions. Those four portions are the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the cerebellum, and the brain stem. Again, those are the cerebrum, diencephalon, cerebellum, and brain stem. The cerebrum is the largest part of the brain. It has two halves, two hemispheres. So, the largest part of the brain, which is the cerebrum, has two halves called hemispheres. They're separated by a piece of membrane called the falx cerebri. You have the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is the structure that actually connects the two halves of the cerebral hemispheres. The gyri, so the bumps or ridges on the brain that we notice when we look at the brain, those are called gyri. Gyri is plural for gyrus. So the grooves or the dips between the gyri are called sulci. Singular is sulcus. And then you have fissures. Fissures, we already learned that fissures are slit-like openings or in the bone, but in the brain, fissures are deep grooves. All right, so there are grooves that are deeper than sulci on the surface. We have two main fissures on the brain or in the brain. We have the longitudinal fissure and the transverse fissure. The longitudinal fissure is the fissure that separates the two halves of the cerebrum. So it separates the cerebral hemispheres. The transverse fissures are or is the structure that separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum. So looking here, this that separates the two cerebral hemispheres is the longitudinal fissure. And if you look at this this above image, this space that separates the cerebellum from the cerebrum is the transverse fissure. If you continue looking at the cerebrum, there are 5 lobes or 5 parts of the cerebrum. You have the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the insula. You notice that the first 4 lobes are named for the bones that sit on top of them. So frontal lobe sits under or is protected by the frontal bone. Parietal lobe is protected by the parietal bone. Temporal lobe protected by the temporal bone. Occipital lobe protected by occipital bone. The insula is something that we haven't seen before. It's also called the island of Rail. I'm sure Rail is pronounced other ways, but I don't know them. So the insula is what sits deep inside of the lateral sulcus. So let's go back to the previous image. And the lateral sulcus would be here. So you noticed here is the lateral sulcus that separates the temporal lobe from the frontal lobe, lateral sulcus. When we take the temporal lobe and we pull it back so that you can see the structures deep, that is what this image is, image C, the lateral lobe is pulled back, that's what retracted means. I'm sorry, the temporal lobe is retracted so that you can see what's deep to it. That is the insula. That is that 5th lobe of the brain, of the cerebrum. So in the cerebrum, you have gray matter and you have white matter. So remember that the gray matter is made up of unmyelinated axons as well as cell bodies, because the cell bodies also are not myelinated. Only axons are myelinated. So the gray matter is what makes up the cerebral cortex. Remember, anytime you see cortex, think the outside portion of some structure. In the cerebrum, the cortex is that gray matter, so it's going to be darker around the edges. Almost 75% of the neuron cell bodies in the nervous system are located in the cerebral cortex that make up this gray matter. So 75% of the cell bodies, so of all the neurons in your body, all the neurons in your body, from the tips of your toes to the tip of your nose, all the neurons that are made up in your body, 3/4 of the cell bodies of all of those neurons are located in the cerebral cortex. Seems that's so much that is so fascinating to me. Anyway, white matter is deep to the cerebral cortex in the brain. This makes up most of the cerebrum, and this is where bundles of myelinated axons are connected to cell bodies. They're bundled together to make up the white matter. So white matter is made up of your bundled myelinated axons. Your gray matter is made up of unmyelinated axons as well as neuron cell bodies. So going back to the previous image. Nope, that's not the one I want to look at. We'll see it when we get back to the other images. So functions of the cerebral cortex. Basically, the cerebral cortex is responsible for you being able to sit in this class and to take in high amounts of information, process that information, stress out about that information, but then take that information and organize it in your brain in such a way that it makes sense and that you can remember it and eventually be able to use that information. That is higher mental functioning. So you can interpret sensory impulses from your sensory organs. You can initiate voluntary movements. You can store lots of information in your memory. You can retrieve that stored information whenever you want. It may not always come out easily, but you can eventually retrieve that information. You have reasoning skills, and you have some level of intelligence and a personality. All of that is what makes you you. All of that is the function of the cerebral cortex, that higher mental function. And all of that is what separates us from those lower life forms or other animals. This functioning of the cerebral cortex in all of these movements. The cerebral cortex can be divided into sensory, association, and motor areas. Some of these areas overlap, but sensory, association, and motor areas. Each of those areas will contain a group of neurons that work together to form some particular function. So what you notice here in this image is the circles that overlie some parts of the brain, and then you have the different colors of the different parts of the brain. These little circles that overlie the areas tell you what these different localized areas of the brain do. So this is the frontal eye field. This is where part of your visual functioning will be located. Here you have the area involved in concentration, planning, and problem solving. Here you have the area that is responsible for hearing. This is the area that's responsible for helping you to form words, to be able to speak, etc. So all of these are different functional areas of the cerebral cortex, allowing you to have higher mental function. We're going to stop there and continue on in the next video.